President of the United States has criticized Iran's leadership for claiming the two countries are not negotiating to end the war. Tehran has denied any direct engagement with the U.S. and said progress on a Strait of Hormuz deal is happening through negotiations with Oman. Donald Trump had previously said he held off on a massive weekend attack against Iran because there was a deal in the making. All right, let's take a closer look at the Strait of Hormuz and who controls shipping there. So located between Oman and Iran, it's only 39 kilometers at its widest point. Oman controls the southern shipping lane through which most traffic passed before the conflict began. Iran controls the northern side of the strait, and Tehran has long insisted that route to become the main direction for vessel traffic. Under the model being discussed by Oman and Iran right now, ships would enter along the northern route and leave the strait using the southern route.
We are working in cooperation with Oman so that in the soonest possible time we can open a temporary safe route in the Strait of Hormuz. This negotiation is between two coastal nations. Others can be constructive partners, but this is between Iran and Oman. The Strait of Hormuz is not closed because of differences between the governments of Iran and Oman. It is closed because of the aggression by America and the Zionist regime. And as long as that aggression continues, the situation in the Strait of Hormuz will not change.
All right, joining me here in the studio is Joey Hood, former U.S. ambassador to Tunisia and former acting director of the Office of Iranian Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. And from Geneva is Ali Vaez. He's the deputy program director for Middle East and North Africa at the International Crisis Group. Welcome to you both. Ambassador, we'll start with you. When President Trump called off these strikes, he said that, look, the parameters of the deal were agreed to, and that would include the immediate opening of the Strait of Hormuz. Was that a bit of an overstatement?
Well, thanks for having me, Scott. Yes, I think it was. I think it was meant to calm the oil markets, which apparently it did. But at the same time, I think it could also be a reflection of a bit of over-optimism on the part of the mediators, which is not uncommon when you're negotiating indirectly. And it's I would say I can't compare it to any previous situation because I've never heard of a diplomatic negotiation in which the mediators are being repeatedly bombed by one of the parties to the negotiation. So that may have something to do with it as well, that the mediators really, really want a deal. And so perhaps they're being a bit too optimistic in the way that they frame what they're hearing from the Iranian side.
That's an interesting point. Ali, we'll come to you next. Do you think that this military buildup that we saw from the United States, these threats of a massive, large-scale attack on energy infrastructure, do you think that there really was a possibility that that could have gone ahead, or do you think that this was a bluff all along?
I do believe that there was a real possibility because the president is very frustrated with this situation. The options in front of him are either an unwinnable war or an unpalatable peace. And so he vacillates between the two all the time. And the military has provided him with options if he wants to escalate. He understands the risks, both in terms of a political backlash for him at home if inflation continues to increase, but also backlash in the region because it's U.S. allies in the region who are target of Iranian retaliation. But again, also reaching a peace deal with Iran is difficult for him to sell, especially a deal in which Iran remains in control of the Strait of Hormuz.
An unwinnable war and an unpalatable peace is such an interesting way to put it. Ambassador, do you think the Americans have in fact recognized the limits of military might here, that they're not going to get to a deal by using military power?
Well, let's make a distinction between the Americans and Donald Trump, because those are two very different things. The American public has never been behind this war in the first place, and they're less and less behind it as every day goes by. President Trump, on the other hand, is the one who makes the decisions, especially with regard to the projection of military power. And no, I don't think that he has quite understood the limits of U.S. military power, because he's looking at the IRGC leadership in Tehran as if it were representative of a typical government. And likewise, they're looking at him as if he were a typical president, and they're both completely wrong. So the application of more military power against an atypical regime like that led by the IRGC is not going to produce a different result. In fact, it's probably going to backfire. But at the same time, it's backfiring mostly against the Gulf Arab states. And so that clearly is part of Iran's strategy to try to drive a wedge between them and the United States, and that's manifestly not working at all. In fact, it's pushing those governments further and closer to the United States, despite their reservations with Donald Trump and his decision-making.
Ali, all of this, the breakdown of the Memorandum of Understanding, it all comes back to paragraph 5 of the Memorandum of Understanding. The Iranians think that it means that they effectively control the Strait of Hormuz, that everyone going through it has to coordinate with them. It doesn't say that in plain language, but that's how they interpret it. Do you think that they might be willing to compromise in this round of negotiations, or at some point in the future, to perhaps control the strait but not charge a toll? Or do you think that they're willing to entirely relinquish control over the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, Scott, I think the control is so much more important for them than the financial value of the strait.
But explain this to me, because I don't understand why the control is important here if you're not going to charge a toll.
Well, the control is important for two reasons. One, as a deterrent, because they want to be able to demonstrate to the U.S. that if it decides to do this again, if Iran doesn't want to become another Lebanon, another Gaza, in which every now and then the U.S. or Israel decide to attack it again. And clearly its missiles and its drones have punished the other side, but they haven't really deterred it. So they know that by being able to take the global economy as hostage, they can deter future attacks against them. So that's one element. But there's also another element that I think is often overlooked, which is the fact that for 4 decades, the Iranians allowed U.S. warships to pass through the strait and basically allowed an armada to be formed on their southern shores, which eventually attacked them twice in less than a year. They don't want to let this happen again. And this is why having full control over the strait is just so strategically important for them. And I would argue in terms of the revenue generation aspect, it is in reverse correlation to U.S. willingness to provide Iran with sanctions relief. I would argue that if President Trump had allowed Iran access to its own money, its own frozen assets during the implementation of the MOU, and not even a single penny actually went to the Iranians would not insist on charging any kind of fee at the Strait in the Strait of Hormuz.
Ambassador, do you agree with that? That the Iranians would be okay with no toll so long as they can get access to their own money and unlock the financial part of the MOU, as Ali says?
Not exactly. I'll build on what Ali was saying. Some 40 years ago, the regime decided that it would have a forward defense strategy so that it could push future conflict away from the borders of Iran as far as possible after a very, very disastrous war with the forces of Saddam Hussein. So it invested heavily in these proxy armies, these militias across the region. And largely, American presidents went along with that. And so where there was low-level conflict between the United States and Iran, it was via these proxy forces. This is the first time now that the conflict has actually come to the Iranian mainland. And so by threatening shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, what they want to do is not just to try to, again, push the conflict further from their borders by forcing the U.S. military to withdraw from the entire region, but also to gain control, as Ali said, taking economically taking hostage the world economy, but very specifically the Gulf economies and Iraq. Because whether they charge a toll or not, if they can decide what ships they fire on or not going through the Strait of Hormuz, that means they have a very powerful weapon over the Gulf economies and Iraq. You make the decisions that I want you to make, otherwise I'm going to close the valve.
Nobody's going to mess with them.
Yep.
All right. Ambassador Joey Hood, former U.S. ambassador to Tunisia, and Ali Vaez, the director of the Iran Project of the International Crisis Group. We appreciate you guys being here.